At first, the two yards were as much alike as the two houses, each house being the exact copy of the other. They were just two of those little red brick dwellings that one is always seeing side by side in the outskirts of a city, and looking as if the occupants must be alike too. But these two families were quite different. Mr. Gilton, who lived in one, was a pretty cross sort of man, and was quite well-to-do, as cross people sometimes are. He and his wife lived alone, and they did not have much going out and coming in either. Mrs. Gilton would have liked more of it, but she had given up thinking about it, for her husband had said so many times that it was women's tomfoolery to want to have people whom you weren't anything to and who weren't anything to you, ringing your doorbell all the time and bothering around in your dining room, which of course it was, and she would have believed it if a woman ever did believe anything a man says a great many times. In the other house there were 5 children, and as Mr. Gilton said, they made too large a family, and they ought to have gone somewhere else. Possibly they would have gone had it not been for the fence. But when Mr. Gilton put it up, and Mr. Bilton told him it was 3 inches too far on his land, and Mr. Gilton said he could go to law about it, expressing the idea forcibly, Mr. Bilton was foolish enough to take his advice. The decision went against him, and a good deal of his money went with it, for it was a long, teasing lawsuit, and instead of being 3 inches of made ground, it might have been 3 degrees of the Arctic Circle for the trouble there was in getting at it. So Mr. Bilton had to stay where he was. It was then that the yards began to take on those little differences that soon grew to be very marked. Neither family would plant any vines because they would have been certain to heedlessly beautify the other side. And consequently, the fence, in all its primitive boldness, stood out uncompromisingly, and the other 1 or 2 little bits of trees grew carefully on the farther side of the enclosure, so as not to be mixed up in the trouble at all. But Mr. Gilton's grass was cut smoothly by the man who made the fires, while Mr. Bilton only found the chance to cut his himself once in 2 weeks. Then, by and by, Mr. Gilton bought a red garden bench and put it under the tree that was nearest to the fence. No one ever went out and sat on it, to be sure, but to the Bilton children it represented the visible flush of prosperity. Particularly was Cora Cordelia wont to peer through the fence and gaze upon that red bench, thinking it a charming place in which to play house, ignorant of the fact that much of the red paint would have come off on her back. Cora Cordelia was the youngest of the 5. All the rest had very simple names: John, Walter, Fanny, and Susan. But when it came to Cora Cordelia, luxuries were beginning to get very scarce in the Bilton family, and Mrs. Bilton felt that she must make up for it by being lavish, in one direction or another. She had wished to name Fanny Cora and Susan Cordelia, but she had yielded to her husband and called one after his mother and one after herself, and then gave both her favorite names to the youngest of all. Cora Cordelia was a pretty little girl, prettier even than both her names put together. After the red bench came a quicksilver ball that was put in the middle of the yard and reflected all the glory of its owner, albeit in a somewhat distorted form. This effort of human ingenuity filled the Bilton children with admiration, bordering on awe. Cora Cordelia spent hours gazing at it, until called in and reproved by her mother for admiring so much things she could not afford to have. After this, she only admired it covertly. Small distinctions like these barbed the arrows of contrast and comparison and kept the disadvantages of neighborhood ever present. Then it was a constant annoyance to have their surnames so much alike. Matters were made more unpleasant by mistakes of the butcher, the grocer, and so on. Gilton 79 Holmes Avenue was so much like Bilton 77 Holmes Avenue. Gilton changed his butcher every time he sent his dinner to Bilton, and though the mistakes were generally rectified, neither of the two families ever forgot the time the Biltons positively ate, the Gilton dinner under a misapprehension. Mrs. Bilton apologized, and Mrs. Gilton boldly told her husband that she was glad they'd had it, and she hoped they'd enjoyed it, which only made matters worse, and altogether it was a dark day, the only joy of it being that fearful one snatched by John, Walter, Susan, Fanny, and Cora Cordelia from the undoubted excellence of the roast. Of course, there was an assortment of minor difficulties. The smoke from the Biltons' kitchen blew in through the windows of the Giltons' sitting room when the wind was in one direction, and when it was in the other, many of the clothes from the Giltons' clothesline were blown into the Biltons' yard, and Fanny, Susan, or Cora Cordelia had to be sent out to pick them up and drop them over the fence again, which Mrs. Bilton said was very wearing, as of course it must have been. Things like this were always happening, but matters reached a climax when it came to the dog. It wasn't a large dog, but it was a tiresome one. It got up early in the morning and barked. Now, we all know that early rising is a good thing and honorable among all men, but it is something that ought to be done quietly, out of regard to the weaker vessels. And a dog that barks between 5 and 7 in the morning, continuously, certainly ought to be suppressed, even if it be necessary to use force. Everybody agreed with the Biltons about that. Everybody except the Giltons themselves, who by some of nature's freaks didn't mind it. Mrs. Bilton often said she wished Mrs. Gilton could be a light sleeper for a week and see what it was like. So too everybody thought that Mr. Bilton had right on his side when he complained that this same dog came into his yard, being apparently indifferent to any coolness between the estate owners, and ran over a bed of geraniums and one thing and another. That was the small Bilton offset to the Gilton bench and ball. But when, one morning for the first time, that dog remained quiet and restful, and was found cold and poisoned, and Mr. Gilton was loud in his accusations of the Bilton boys and their father, public opinion wavered for a moment. After that incident, no member of either family spoke to any member of the other. That was the way the matters stood the day before Christmas. It was snowing hard, and the afternoon grew dark rapidly, and the whirling flakes pursued a blinding career. In spite of that, everybody was out, doing the last thing, Mrs. Gilton was not, to be sure. Of course, they would have a big dinner, but even that was all arranged for, although the turkey hadn't come, and her husband was going to stop and see about it on his way home. She shuddered as the possibility of its having gone to the Biltons occurred to her. But she didn't believe it had. They hadn't the same butcher any longer. Meanwhile, there was so little to do. It was too dark to read or sew, and she sat idly at the window looking out at the passes and the driving snow. Everybody else was in a hurry. She wished she too had occasion to hasten down for a last purchase, or to light the lamp in order to finish a last bit of dainty sewing, as she used to do when she was a girl. She seemed to have so few friends now with whom she exchanged Christmas greetings. Was it then only for children and youth, this Christmas cheer? And must she necessarily have left it behind her with her girlhood? No, she knew better than that. She felt that there was a deeper significance in the Christmas tide than can come home to the hearts of children, and unthoughtfulness, and yet it had grown to be so painfully like other days. An occasion for a little bigger dinner. That was about all. With an unconscious sigh, she looked across to the Bilton house. Plenty of people over there to make merry. 5 stockings to hang up. She wished she might have sent something in. To be sure, there was a dog, but that was some time ago. Very likely the dog would have been dead by now anyhow. She felt herself that this logic was not irrefutable, but she wished she could have sent some paper parcels, just the same. So strong had this impulse been that she had said to her husband somewhat timidly that morning, "There are a good many of those Bilton children to get presents for." "More fools they that get them presents then," he had pleasantly replied. "I don't suppose he has much to buy them with," she continued. "He had enough to buy poison for my dog," exclaimed her husband, giving his newspaper an angry shake. "I'd almost like to send them in some cheap little toys." "Well, as long as you don't quite like to, it won't do any harm," he said with some violence, laying down his newspaper and looking at her in a manner not to be misunderstood. "But you see that the liking doesn't get any farther." "It's Christmas, you know," said his plucky wife. "Oh, no, I don't know," he replied gruffly. "I haven't fallen over 40 children a minute in the street with their ridiculous parcels, and I haven't had women drop brown paper bundles that come undone all over me when they crowd into the horse car, and I haven't found it impossible to get to the shirt collar counter on account of Christmas novelties. Oh, no, I didn't know it was Christmas." After that, there was really not much to be said, for we all know Christmas is dreadfully annoying, and the last thing a man in this sort of temper wants to hear about is peace and goodwill. Notwithstanding the fact that Mrs. Gilton looked over to her neighbors with an envious feeling this dark afternoon, their Christmas cheer was not so abounding as it had been in more prosperous times. There was not very much money to be spent this year, and they were obliged to give up something. Mr. and Mrs. Bilton had decided that it should be the Christmas dinner. They would have a simple luncheon, and let all the money that could be spared go for the stockings. Each child had its own sum to invest for others, and there was still a small amount for the older members of the family. That it was a small amount, Mrs. Bilton felt strongly as she went from shop to shop. But when she reached home again, she was somewhat encouraged. There was such an air of joyous expectation in the house, and her purchases looked larger now that they were away from the glittering counters. Then each of the 5 children came to her separately and confided to her the nothing less than wonderful results of judicious bargaining, which had enabled them to buy useful and beautiful presents for each of the others out of the sums entrusted to their care, ranging in amount from the $2 of John to the 50 cents of Cora Cordelia. She felt sure that there were further secrets yet, secrets attended by brown paper and string, which she had taken the greatest care for the last 2 weeks not heedlessly to expose, riddles of which the solution lay perilously near her eyes, which would be revealed to her astonished gaze the next morning. She had reason to believe that even Cora Cordelia was making something for her, even though it was difficult for her to ignore the fact that it was a neat washcloth. She had hitherto avoided absolute certainty on the subject. So that, altogether, it was a pretty cheerful afternoon at the Biltons. Meanwhile, down in the main street of the city, it was a confusing scene. It was darker there than where the streets were more open, and although there were several daring spirits of that adventurous turn of mind which leads people into byways of discovery, who asserted that the street lamps were lighted, it was not generally believed. The snow was blowing down and up and across, and getting more and more unmanageable under the feet of foot passengers every moment. It was cold and windy and blinding and crowded and a good many other disconcerting things, all of which Mr. Gilton felt the full force of as he stood on the corner where he had just bought his turkey. It was a fine turkey, and had been a good bargain, and though he had to carry it home himself, there was nothing derogatory in that. If it had been anybody else, he would have been thrilled with a glow of satisfaction. But Mr. Gilton was long past glows of satisfaction. It was years since he had permitted himself to have such things. "Journal 5 cents!" screamed an intermittent newsboy in his ear. "Get out!" replied Mr. Gilton, the uncompromising nature of his language being intensified by the fact that he jumped nearly 2 feet from the suddenness of the newsboy's attack. Even the newsboy, inured to the short words of an unfriendly world, and usually quite indifferent thereto, was impressed by the asperity of the suggestion, and moved somewhat hastily on. Possibly his cold, wet little existence had been rendered morbidly susceptible by the general good feeling of the hour, one lady having even spontaneously given him 5 cents. After this exchange of amenities, Mr. Gilton stepped into his horse car. It was crowded, of course, as horse cars that are small and run once in a half an hour are apt to be, and he had to stand up, and the turkey legs stuck out of the brown paper in a very conspicuous way. If Mr. Gilton had been anybody else, he would have been chaffed about his turkey, because to make up for the conveniences that the horse car line did not furnish the public, the large-hearted public furnished the horse car line with an unusual amount of friendliness. There was almost always something going on in those horse cars. Their social privileges were quite a feature. Tonight they were in unusual force on account of the season. But nobody said anything to Mr. Gilton. Only when he jerked the bell and stepped off, one stout man with his overcoat collar turned up to his ears said without turning his head, "I supposed, of course, he was going to give the turkey to the conductor." Everybody laughed in that end of the car, except one small old lady in the corner who was a stranger and visiting, and who was left with the impression that the gentleman who got off must be a very kind man. It was darker and blowier and snowier than when he had left the corner, and Mr. Gilton floundered through the unbroken drifts up the little path to the door with increasing grudges in his heart against the difficulties of Christmas. The lock was off, and he went in slamming the door after him. There was no light in the hall, and he murmured loudly against the inconvenience. "Confound it," he said. "Why didn't they light the gas? I'm not one of those confounded Biltons. I can't afford to pay for what I don't get." And without pausing to take off his hat and coat, he strode to the sitting-room door and flung it open. That was an awful moment. The sudden change from the cold and darkness almost blinded him and confirmed the impression that he was the victim of an illusion. The sound of many voices and then the hush of sudden consternation was in his ears. There was a lamp, and there was a fire, and there, between them, sat Mr. Bilton on one side and Mrs. Bilton on the other, and round about, in various unconventional attitudes, sat 4 Bilton children. And there, in the very midst of them, in his heavy overcoat, with snow melting on his hat, his beard, and his shoulders, stood Mr. Gilton. The unexpected scene, the amazed faces gazing into his, rendered him speechless. He wondered vaguely if he were losing his reason. Then, in a flush of enlightenment, he realized what had happened. Thanks to the storm outside, he had come into the wrong house. Naturally, his first impulse was towards flight. But as his bewildered gaze slipped about the room, it fell upon 5 stockings hung against the mantelpiece, and stayed there, fascinated. 5 foolish, limp, expressionless stockings. It was long since he had seen such an unreasonable spectacle. Then he recollected himself and looked around him. Perhaps even then, if he had made a dash for the door, he might have escaped and matters have been none the worse. But in that instant of hesitation, caused by the sudden sight of those 5 stockings, something dreadful occurred. It must be premised that Cora Cordelia did not know Mr. Gilton very well by sight, being in the first place small and not noticing, and in the second filled with an unreasoning fear that caused her to flee whenever she had seen him approach. This is the only excuse for what she did, for while her mother was feebly murmuring as if in extenuation, "We thought it was John coming in," Cora Cordelia clasped her hands in delirious delight and cried aloud, "It's Santa Claus! Oh, it's Santa Claus!" Could anything more awful happen to a cross man, a very cross man, than to be taken for Santa Claus? Mr. Gilton looked at Cora Cordelia and wondered why she had not been slaughtered in her cradle. "And," exclaimed Susan Bilton with sudden communicative fervour, "he has come and brought us a turkey for tomorrow's dinner." The truth was that Susan had been coming to the age that is skeptical about Santa Claus, but she could not resist this sudden appearance. No one could appreciate the nonsense of the whole situation better than Mr. Gilton. And yet, strangely enough, together with his annoyance was mingled a touch of the strange feeling that had dawned upon him first when he saw the stockings. To be sure, it only added to his annoyance, but it was there. By this time, it was really a very short time, Mrs. Bilton had recovered herself and risen, and Mr. Bilton had risen too. "Hush, children, it's not Santa Claus," she said. "It's Mr. Gilton. We are glad to see you, Mr. Gilton." And she held out her hand to him. "Won't you sit down?" She felt that he had come in the Christmas spirit, and she was anxious to meet him halfway. "Yes," said her husband, coming forward, and instantly taking his cue from his wife, for he was really a very nice man. "We are very glad." To be sure, in his manner there was a certain stiffness, for a man cannot always change completely in a moment as a woman can. But Mr. Gilton was too perplexed to notice this. In the incomprehensible way that one's mind has of clinging to unimportant things at great crises, while he was fuming with rage and bothered with his strange feeling, which was not precisely rage, he was wondering how in the world he was going to sit down with that ridiculous turkey, with its ridiculous legs in his arms, and not look more absurd than he did now. In this moment of absent-mindedness, he had mechanically taken Mrs. Bilton's hand and shaken it, and after that, of course, there was nothing to do except to shake Mr. Bilton's. Then he began to know it was all up. He had not spoken yet, but now he made a frantic effort to save what might be left besides honor. "I came," he began, "I came to your house." There he paused a moment, and that unlucky child, with that tendency to be possessed by one idea, which is characteristic of small and trivial minds, and for which she should have been shaken, burst in with, "And did the reindeer bring you? And are they outside?" He almost groaned. So overwhelmed was he by this new idiocy. Reindeer! If those overworked, struggling car horses could have heard that. Then Mrs. Bilton, pitying his evident confusion, came to his assistance. "Don't mind the children, Mr. Gilton," she said, her cheeks flushing and looking very pretty with the excitement of the unusual circumstances. "We're glad you came, however you made your way here. I think we may thank Christmas Eve for it. Now, do take off your overcoat and sit down." Oh, mispraised woman's tact! What complications you may produce! That finished it, of course. He sat down. In those few moments that strange feeling had grown marvelously stronger. It seemed to be made up of the most diverse elements, a mixture of green wreaths and his own childhood, and his mother, and a top he had not thought of for years, and the wide fireplace at home, and a stable with a child in it, and a picture in a book he used to read of a lot of angels in the sky, one particular one in the middle, and underneath it some words. What were the words? He'd forgotten they had anything to do with Christmas anyway. "But you did bring us the turkey, didn't you?" said Cora Cordelia, helping her mother on. To do the child justice, for even Cora Cordelia has a right to demand justice, her manners were corrupted by Christmas expectancy. "Cora Cordelia, I'm ashamed of you," said Mrs. Bilton. "Yes," said Mr. Gilton, the word wrung from his lips, while beads stood on his forehead. "Yes, I brought you the turkey." "Did you really?" exclaimed Mrs. Bilton, who thought he had all the time. "That was very kind of you." "Will you please take it? Take it away," he said with that wish to have something over which we associate with the dentist. So Mrs. Bilton took the turkey and thanked him and gave it to Fanny, who carried it out of the kitchen, and Mr. Gilton gave one last look at its legs as it went through the door, feeling that now he must wake up from this nightmare. But things only went farther and became more incredible and upsetting, only that, strangely enough, that feeling of horror began to wear off, and that singular strain of association with all sorts of Christmas things to grow stronger. He himself could hardly believe that it was no worse when he found himself seated by the littered table with Mrs. Bilton near and Mr. Bilton over by the fire again, listening to first one and then the other, and occasionally letting fall a word himself, his conversational powers seeming to thaw out along with the snow on his greatcoat. These words themselves were a surprise to him. He was quite sure that he had started them with a credible gruffness, but the Christmas air mellowed them in a highly unsatisfactory fashion, so that they fell on his own ears quite otherwise than as he had meant they should sound. Moreover, the general tenor of the conversation was exceedingly perplexing. It was all about how fine it was of him to come this evening, and how they had often regretted the hard feeling, and how things always did get exaggerated. Of course, he would not have believed a word of it if he had been able to get any grip on the situation, but he wasn't, and he just went on assenting to it all as if it were true. There came a time when Mr. Bilton cleared his throat, hesitated a moment, and then said boldly, "I think I ought to tell you, Mr. Gilton, that I had nothing whatever to do with the death of your dog." Mr. Gilton fell to the ground, slipping away from under his very feet. That dog has been his pièce of résistance, as it were. "I wouldn't have poisoned him," went on Mr. Bilton, "for $100. But," he added with a queer little smile, "I wasn't going to tell you so, you know." "Of course you wasn't," exclaimed Mr. Gilton hurriedly, with a touch of that unholy excitement that a lapse from grammar imparts. "We wouldn't, any of us," asserted Walter. "No," said Susan, Fanny, and Cora Cordelia. Then it came out that the whole family had rather admired the dog than otherwise. It was here that John did really come in, his entrance sounding very much as had Mr. Gilton's. He nearly fell over when he saw the visitor, But he had time to pull himself together, for Cora Cordelia had snatched that moment for showing Mr. Gilton her gifts for the family, and he was bound hand and foot with helplessness. Then they all came and showed him their gifts. While he examined them, Mr. and Mrs. Bilton carefully averted their eyes and gazed hard at the opposite wall, while Cora Cordelia urged him, in stage whispers, not to let them suspect. It was pitiable, the state to which he was reduced. Of course, resisting this Christmas enthusiasm was out of the question. To be sure, it came over him once with startling force as she showed him a toy water wheel that went by sand, which she had purchased for her father at a phenomenally low rate because the wheel could not be made to go, that Cora Cordelia was the very child that he had fallen over as she came hastening out of a toy shop with a queerly shaped bundle the day before, and so been further embittered towards Christmas. Susan had purchased a cup and bowl for her mother, and as she went out of the room for a moment, insisted upon Mr. Gilton's trying to do it and see what fun it was. If Mr. Gilton lives to be 100, he will never forget the mingled feelings with which he awkwardly tried to get that senseless ball into that idiotic cup. At last he stood up to go. It was after 6 o'clock, and they went with him to the door, and wished him Merry Christmas, and sent Merry Christmas to Mrs. Gilton, and said good night several times, and he stumbled on through the snow, this time towards his own door. It had stopped snowing as suddenly and quietly as it had begun, and the stars had come out. He gazed up at them, something he very rarely did. They seemed a part of Christmas. Just before he turned in at his own gate, he looked back at the Bilton house and shook his fist at it, but the expression on his face was such that the very same newsboy who had accosted him earlier failed utterly to recognize him and was emboldened to offer him a paper. He, too, was pushing his way home with 2 papers left, in a somewhat dispirited way. "I'll take them both," said this singular customer. "Here's a quarter. Never mind the change. It's Christmas Eve, I believe." And this when he knew perfectly well that a copy of that very same journal was waiting for him on his table. The boy looked at his quarter and looked again at his customer and recognized him and made up his mind to buy a couple of hot sausages on the corner, and went on his way feeling that there was a new heaven and a new earth. Mrs. Gilton was standing at the parlor window, peering out anxiously as he came up the path. She was in the hall as he entered. "Why, Reuben," she said, "I was afraid something had happened." Goodness gracious! As if something hadn't happened. He turned away to hang up his overcoat and tried to speak crossly. "Well," he said, "I've lost my turkey, that's what happened." "Never mind," said Mrs. Gilton quickly. "The other one came later, the first one, you know, so the Biltons didn't get it this time." "They got the second one, though," said Reuben, hanging up his hat. "Oh dear, did they?" said Mrs. Gilton. Then she went on, "Well, I don't care if they did, so there. I guess they need it for their Christmas dinner." "No, they don't," said Reuben, turning around and facing her, "because they're coming to eat part of ours. They're coming in tomorrow to have dinner with us." Every one of them, he asserted more loudly on account of the expression on his wife's face. Bilton and his wife and all the 5 children, down to Cora Cordelia. So, we'll have to have something for them to eat. If Mr. Gilton will never forget the cup and ball, Mrs. Gilton will never forget that moment. She went all over it in her mind whether she could manage him herself tonight or whether to send Bridget right away then for the doctor, and if she hadn't better say a policeman too, and whether he could be kept for the future in a private house or would have to be confined in an asylum. She was inclining towards the asylum when he, who was going into the sitting room before her, turned round and laughed an odd little laugh. She began to think, then, that a private house would do. The next day they all dined together, which proved that it was not all a Christmas Eve illusion. There is a report in the neighborhood that the fence between the houses is to be taken down to make room for a tennis court for the Bilton children. But of course, this may not be true. It would have to be done in the summer, and if the effect of Christmas could be depended upon to last into the summer, this would be a very different sort of world. You've been listening to the story A Christmas Accident by Annie Eliot Trumbull, read by Naya Nomikou. Merry Christmas!